Democracy and freedom of speech go hand in hand, right? But when do my rights to say what I want clash with your right not to be offended? Or is that a false choice? Lots to figure out during this joint initiative between TVO and the Toronto Star, the Democracy Agenda on how much freedom of speech Canadians want. So let's welcome, and as is our tradition, we'll introduce our guests from furthest away to closest to our studio, starting in Brooklyn, New York. There's Irshad Manji, author most recently of Don't Label Me, an incredible conversation for divided times. She's also the founder of Moral Courage College. And back here in Ontario's capital city, in the Junction, Reverend Michael Coren, author most recently of Reclaiming Faith, Inclusion, Grace, and Tolerance. He's also an ordained cleric in the Anglican Church of Canada. In Scarborough, Shree Paradkar, a Toronto Star race and gender columnist. And in East York, Jonathan Kay, Canadian editor and podcaster at the online platform Quillette. And we are delighted to continue this now, I think, is this our fourth time? I think our fourth time with the Toronto Star doing this initiative. Shree, we're really enjoying it a lot, and thank you for your participation in it. Before we actually get to the matter at hand, you are going to forgive me because we want to, I'm just going to kfell a little bit here, okay? That's a technical term. 26 years ago on this channel, we did a show called Studio 2. And every Tuesday night, we saw two quite brilliant, quite wonderful people exercising their free speech rights to the benefit of our viewers. And we thought we'd just take a little jaunt down memory lane. Sheldon, if you would.
The Americans are losing the drug war. Instead of fighting morality on the ground, they're just giving in and saying, make the whole thing legal. Simply won't do.
Well, what won't do is a repressive drug policy, because that's the kind of policy that fosters a society in which people do thumb their nose at the law. People break the law and feel absolutely no sense of culpability because the popular culture and law are in such conflict with one another. And that is the conservatives' nightmare.
That was a wonderful segment we called Friendly Fire, and it was definitely fiery and mostly friendly. And we're absolutely delighted to get...
Steve, you doctored that because I had a full head of hair back then. And so you've changed that just to hurt me.
Well...
Yeah, and Michael, I had a mustache, all right? So, you know, we've changed. We've both changed.
Anyway, I think this is the first time you two have been back on television in 25 years, so we're delighted to make that happen, and it's great to see you two back on TVO. I do want to start, though, by asking, and Irshad, get us started here, can you compare the climate in which you tried to exercise your free speech today compared to back then? What's different?
Oh, Steve, no, I don't think I can compare the climate. For one thing, there was no social media at the time that Michael and I did our Friendly Fire debates, and that is a world of difference already. But I will tell you that shortly after those debates, I hosted a program on City TV. Remember City? When it was still in its cutting edge phase. And it was a show about gay and lesbian, transgender, and queer lives. And part of that show, Steve, the most popular segment, was something called Tell It to the Q, in which we would take pretty offensive emails and voicemails that we received. And I would respond to them. And on top of that, other viewers would respond. So we would be, before the Vox Populi era, we curated conversations that did not exist before. And I have to tell you, I look at those segments today and I think that is the kind of world we should still be living in. Because it was only by airing the hate that people realized they need to be more expressive about their love for LGBTQ people. So today, all we really get are people who are resentful about being told that they're haters, and then labeling those who tell them that they're haters, labeling those people haters at the same time.
Michael, how about to you? Comparison of the climate back then versus today?
Well, I think Irshad was very perceptive. The most fundamental change is social media. It's empowered people. And empowering people, there's both a positive and a negative. It allows all sorts of people to express their view, but it doesn't guarantee those views will be informed, kind, tolerant. So there's some very dark information and opinion out there. It's not as bad as some people say. People can be muted, people can be blocked. I try to use Twitter in a different way if I can. We can call it a crisis if you like, but I would prefer to describe it as a challenge. There was a time when minority voices were unheard. We didn't call it a crisis back then. If Palestinians spoke about their narrative and were accused of anti-Semitism, we didn't say, oh, well, that's a crisis. We have to deal with it. We simply tolerated that. The status quo dominated everything. Times have changed, and I welcome them. Now, in that change, there is, of course, a breathing of the revolution that can cause problems. There are innocent people who have been targeted. There are vulnerable people who have been targeted. There are those people who are offended because they want to be offended. But within that, I think we are creating a more courteous, balanced, and just society where free speech genuinely means freedom, because there's context, there's wealth, there's privilege, there's race, there's history. It's not just everyone having a voice. We have to look to the past and to the present and, of course, to the future.
Jonathan, do you feel as free today to express your opinions as you did, say, 25 years ago?
I feel free. I've never been censored. But I'm a little bit of a special case. I'm privileged. I've been in the media a long time. My concern is more for people who are younger, who are starting out their careers, especially in anything to do with journalism or academia, and who don't have that privilege and who know that they can end their career with a single tweet. I think the biggest change has been that when I was starting my career, when I started to write about these issues in the early 2000s, it was widely acknowledged that the biggest threat to free speech was on the side of government. And so we looked at human rights tribunals, we looked to hate speech laws, and it was just assumed that the model of censorship that we were fighting was Big Brother. And I don't think that's the case anymore. In fact, it probably hasn't been the case for 10 or 15 years. Government is largely a bystander to many of the arguments that people are now having about cancel culture and free speech and such. I've been to this is before COVID. I've been to conferences where YouTubers and stuff, they would argue about free speech. And what was interesting is the subject of government censorship never came up. It was all about, like, what's Jack Dorsey doing at Twitter? What's Zuckerberg doing at Facebook? What's Tumblr doing? What Reddits are being permitted on that website? So you kind of have like half a dozen guys in Silicon Valley who are deciding what you can say on social media. That's the biggest change, is not left-right. It's the change from government oversight, from the marketplace of ideas, to largely corporate oversight. And what's weird is that leftists are cheering on these multi-billionaires and urging them to have more power to censor views they don't like. So you have this weird coalition between self-styled progressives and some of the richest people on the planet. That to me is one of the biggest transformations we've seen.
Shree, how about you? Do you feel in this supposedly free and democratic society that you are able to express yourself as much as you'd like to?
Absolutely. In Canada especially, I feel that given the topics that I write about, I have never faced government interference of any kind at all. And I think for the most part, most of us go around our lives, go about without worrying about whether we are being tapped, whether our private messages are being surveilled. So I would say, yeah, the state of free speech in this country is really good. However, I do think we need to be vigilant about the fact that it's not the same for all journalists. There was the Oneida journalist called Carl Dockstader, for instance, in September. He was arrested and banished by the police from the Land Back Lane protests in near Caledonia. And in December, the charges were dropped because there was no reasonable chance of a conviction. Mm-hmm. So we do have to be really vigilant about who's being surveilled, whose rights, what obstructions exist, how are protesters being treated. So there are free speech threats, but personally, I don't face them.
I'm so interested in all of those answers because we're going to share some numbers now from a survey that we just did last month. This was an online survey done for The Agenda pertaining to free speech, 1,500 respondents. And the question asked was, how comfortable are you sharing your opinions with, and then we have a variety of subjects here. How comfortable are you sharing your opinions with friends? 69% of people say, yes, they're comfortable sharing their opinions with friends. How about with your parents? Well, now we're fewer than half the people. 46% say yes. How about with workmates or schoolmates? Fewer than a third of people feel comfortable in those circumstances. And how about Canadians sharing their views in public? Fewer than 1 in 5 felt comfortable sharing their views with the public. Now, according to the Democracy Index survey in The Economist, we in Canada are living in the 5th best democracy in the entire world. But when that small a number of people feel comfortable expressing themselves in public, I've got to ask the question, okay, Rev Coren, start us off here. How good should we feel about that?
We should never feel particularly good about anything. I think the vaccination issue has told us that. We can be complacent. Look, there's perception and there's reality. And I think there is a certain chill taking place. Jonathan made the point earlier. And by the way, we have to distinguish between the Western world and the non-Western world. There are parts of the world where journalists aren't allowed to say anything at all. People aren't allowed free expression either. But in Canada, there is a certain feeling, I think, that the people have been almost convinced that if they speak their mind, not even particularly offensively so, they could be in trouble. I don't think that's the reality generally. Now, there are excesses, as I mentioned earlier. I've seen them, but I'm an aberration in many ways in that I went back to university 5 years ago as an old person. And for 4 years, I saw various colleges at the University of Toronto. I have to tell you, very little had changed. The kids were probably nicer than when I originally went to university. They worked harder. But free speech didn't seem to be a major issue. People were still expressing themselves. But I would agree there is a feeling out there that if I speak my mind, I'll get in trouble.
Irshad, I wonder if you could follow up and bring into it the American point of view as well, because you've obviously lived in the States for some time. A recent survey in the U.S. suggested 62% of Americans are afraid to share their political views. Do you notice a difference between the two countries on either side of the border on this front?
Not in the sense of fear. People do live with fear today. Some are resentful about it. Some have simply resigned themselves to it. And, you know, we talked just briefly moments ago about social media. Obviously, given that, you know, one tweet could mean not just character assassination, but frankly, you know, the loss of your job, and certainly the elimination of a healthy reputation up until that point. You know, people do worry about what's going to come out of their mouths. And the other point to make about all of this is that we are living in a time of very low social trust, by which I mean not just trust between citizens and government, but frankly, trust between and among people. People generally believe that if we are going to say anything that's going to tweak somebody else's nose, even inadvertently, that discussion will instantly become a debate. And I have seen, Steve, with my own eyes and with my own ears, have heard people don't feel comfortable with debate. Only the loudest, most extreme voices go after debate. They you know, foment it. But everybody else who's basically more interested in solutions and getting on with their day than in, you know, bogging themselves down with their egos, most people actually fear having discussions turned into debates, and therefore will think twice before even launching a discussion about something that could be complicated enough to warrant a debate.
Shree, what do you think it says about the state of free speech in Canada when apparently fewer than 1 in 5 of us feels comfortable expressing their views in public?
Some of that could also, I would like to see how that would compare to maybe 5 or 10 years ago, because a lot of people are simply not comfortable being open in public, whether it is because of the pushback they're going to get or whether it's just self-consciousness. To some level, I think this is also about self-censorship. And self-censorship is not necessarily a bad thing if it means that you are about to say something that could be bigoted, racist, misogynistic, and you are stopping yourself to self-reflect upon it. So that's not such a bad thing. A little bit of self-reflection and thinking through consequences is a good thing. if we are talking in terms of debate, I have to agree with Irshad that I don't even believe debate is the best way to solve these problems, because a debate is not necessarily a place of trust where you don't begin with any kind of a common ground. Whereas on a person to person interaction level, yes, you have a certain maybe relationship and you can begin with that. Social media may not be the best place, but often that's where a lot of pushback happens, because especially if it is by traditionally marginalized people who've never had access to those so-called debates or discussions. And this is one place that they had that access, and they're using that access point to push back. And in return, what would be nice is if people who have never been challenged before stop to listen and ask why. Why is it that somebody is pushing back? Is what they're saying actually not right? Instead, what happens is if you're used to never being challenged, you get invested in a certain narrative, and then you are not interested in change or contrition or reflection.
Shree, can I just quickly push back on just one point that you make there? I think it's very true that some people have never been challenged and don't want to be. But I would suggest it is equally true today that all kinds of people who are told that they are privileged want to understand what that means, how that works in their lives. Often, though, when they ask why, and they ask it publicly, they are told, it is not my job to educate you. And so they get slapped down, not once, but often twice and beyond. There's a point at which that becomes humiliation. And that is when it begins to sting and when it curdles into something that we might call, much later on in the process, resentment and radicalization. So it is equally incumbent upon those of us who have been told, let me just finish, Michael, please. We have those of us who have been told that now we have access, let's use it, to the utmost. It's equally incumbent upon us to ensure that we're using these sorts of platforms with grace and with some humility, because that is the best way for us to get heard.
Let me just suggest here, Shree, you should come back on that. Then we need to hear from Jonathan and then Michael. Go ahead, please, Shree.
Yes, I think we could, I think all public conversation could be more gracious, but it's also, it is an unfair reality that it is the burden of the most oppressed to raise their voices against that oppression. I don't count myself as one of those oppressed, just to get that out of the way. However, how many times are you going to explain basic concepts like white privilege? If you can Google that and get extremely thoughtful, broad-based understanding of it, it's really not the job of a person on Twitter to be explaining white privilege over and over again. And there is a point of exhaustion. So I do have some compassion with that exhaustion too.
John Kay.
Look, white privilege exists. Steve, you had me on a show a couple of years ago, and I remember you pulled this stunt where you said, put a point to the person who has the most white privilege. And I think people either pointed to you or to me. I pointed to myself. I think it exists. Though I agree with Irshad that if you're going to beat people over the head with it constantly, including, by the way, people who are not that privileged, like you see examples of people who are very poor, struggling, unemployed, working class white people who are being hectored by upper middle class people of all races about how privileged they are because of the color of their skin. Meanwhile, they can't feed their kids and they're living out of their car. I don't think that's like a useful totalizing moral framework. And to say, oh, well, we're exhausted from talking about white privilege, there's a lot of really underprivileged people who are exhausted by being hectored about it. So I think there's a balance to be had there. The statistics you had before about whether people can say what they feel, the problem with those meta statistics is there's really two kinds of societies right now. One of the reasons I like to do things like play disc golf and go board gaming and stuff is I like to meet people who are off Twitter and who don't live in that universe. And what I love about those societies is like they're very casual and they're high trust environments. I think it was Irshad and Michael, they were talking about this issue. And in high trust environments, you can talk candidly about this stuff. You can make jokes. I was on the disc golf course and some guy said, "Oh man, he's pretty good for a little Chinese guy." And I mean, it was a mixed race group of people, and they were all laughing and having fun. And if you said that on Twitter, you'd lose your job. So you have these environments of sort of ordinary people who don't spend their life on Twitter or on university campuses, who, they're just, I don't think they feel especially censored. I think they can say what they want. I think they can joke as they please because they're in high trust environments. But then you get in highly anonymized situations like Twitter, or in professional situations like on campuses or in activist organizations or literary organizations, where you say one wrong syllable and that's it, your career's over. So I'm not sure a single statistic can cover these two milieus. And frankly, I like the milieu that exists in ordinary life. It's one of the reasons that I'm trying to get off Twitter and spend more time doing things like playing disc golf, where you can just interact as ordinary, high-trust human beings.
Michael Coren.
To respond to what Jonathan said, I don't play disc golf, forgive me, but he's right. There is, if you like, a real world. I know it's a clumsy term, but there's a real world and the alternative. And most of what I do as a cleric is mixed with people who simply don't use social media. They don't use Twitter, and they're going through the real natural existence of everyday life. He also made a valid point about class. In the UK, for example, in Britain, a group that now is causing great concern is white working class young men, boys. They can't tick any of the boxes, but they're often living in terrible conditions, facing crime, drugs, and so on, and they're not really being listened to. But Irshad, I know what you're saying, Irshad, and it comes out of a great place of compassion. There are some people, certainly, who will beat someone up for simply asking a question. How dare you not know the answer? But not everybody. I mean, I had, on a personal level, quite a change of view about 7 years ago, and a lot of that came into fruition through personal conversation by reaching out to people who probably had a fair reason to say to me, shut up, but they didn't. They actually walked with me and helped me and taught me and listened to me. We're all part of this, and I think it's inevitable. There is on the right and the left an extremism that is incredibly intolerant. It represents a fringe. In the mass middle, this might sound banal, but in the mass middle, most people, I don't believe, behave in that way. I think there is a desire to learn and to listen. And one last point. I realize that sometimes people can be intolerant in response. Why don't you know that already? But these are often people who have been effectively silenced for not just a decade, not just a generation, but throughout history. So we must allow a little bit of pushback. But I would agree, when it comes to vulnerable people, kids, students, being attacked, losing their jobs, for one phrase, one expression, no, unacceptable.
And Michael, just real quickly, it's precisely because the people with whom you engaged listened and responded and developed that relationship with you. That is a big part of the reason that you felt comfortable changing. If they were in your face, insulting you, mocking you, ridiculing you, it would have been only too natural for you to become that much more defensive and either walk away or lash back. This is my point. Right. The way we use our freedom of speech matters at least as much as what we say.
Let me throw some new numbers out here as well, and I'll get the four of you to chew into these for a second. Board 3, please, Sheldon, if we could here. Okay, limits on free speech. Freedom of speech does not guarantee freedom from social consequences. 91% of people surveyed agreed with that notion. People who make racial slurs ought to be stopped from speaking. 85% of people agree with that. The government needs to regulate hate speech on social media. 3/4 of people agree with that notion. Radical ideas should be censored for the public good. 53% of people agreed with that idea. And finally, people that express offensive ideas should lose their jobs. 48% of people surveyed agreed with that. John Kay, what stands out for you on that list?
Well, the idea that 48% of people who express offensive ideas should lose their jobs. I'm going to go back to something Irshad said. What happens when you take somebody who, they say something offensive, and I'm not talking about something like completely over the top. Like I'm not talking about Holocaust denial or genocide advocacy. I mean, just like crazy stuff. I'm talking about things that are just sort of like, ordinary, everyday, politically incorrect things. And you say you're going to lose your job. Does that person who loses their job go home and say, wow, I really need to educate myself about intersectionality. This period of unemployment is a great time to watch some videos by Robin DiAngelo. Thank you. Thank you for giving me this period of reflection. No, of course not. They're going to become more vested in whatever ideological vector took them to, and it may have been no ideology. I mean, sometimes people just say casually intolerant stuff. And one thing that I object to is the idea that any form of intolerance is itself kind of like tantamount to criminal activity. Like, I know people who just, they're gay people and they don't particularly like being with straight people. Or, some guy, he had a bad experience in Central Asia and he doesn't like Uzbeks. Or, it happens. Like, not everybody, some people don't like redheads. People are irrational and tribal, and there are people going around with all of these irrational ideas in their head. It's always going to be there because humans are tribal creatures. We shouldn't be regulating thoughts. What we should be doing is making sure those people don't act on those views when they make decisions in their workplace. They shouldn't be bigoted when they make decisions or when they rent an apartment or when they decide who's going to be their neighbor. That should be wrong. But if a person, if a gay guy doesn't like straight people, that's his right. I've never understood this idea that we have to extirpate all forms of intolerance from human brains. Human beings are coded evolutionarily to be wary, to be tribalistic. It's just, unfortunately, it's part of our evolutionary psychology. And we should get over the idea that we're going to cleanse the human mind to such point that we're all perfectly tolerant people. It's never going to happen, unfortunately.
Michael Coren, you've got a look on your face right now.
Well, I mean, with respect, that's not the intention. First of all, the open wound of gay people not wanting to be with straight people is not really affecting the nation state. I mean, let's take another example. Let's take an example of someone who is deeply homophobic, who says that gay people should be ostracized, beaten, or killed. That's still not uncommon in parts of the world.
But I deliberately excluded that. I deliberately excluded extreme cases in my preamble.
John, I mean,
you'll know.
To be fair, I think the examples you're using are, well, I'm not sure how, obviously they're not mainstream, but with respect, I'm not sure how helpful they are. There is a middle way here. I mean, for example, that graph said if you have radical ideas, I think I have radical ideas. Some of what was concluded in that survey was very worrying. I think it's someone applying perhaps what is a noble thought, but then giving it a certain power and almost violence, the idea of losing your job. If you have persecuted someone who you work with, if you've made them feel acutely uncomfortable, yes, I think there we have a very strong argument. Normally, an expression from someone who is not enormously educated, not very sensitive, this can be solved through argument and discussion. What has happened now, I believe, is that people are overreacting to what is a real problem. The problem is real. There is a great deal of pain and suffering and marginalization out there, but the reaction shouldn't be to punish and chastise, but to try and reason. Doesn't always work, but it can do.
I agree with that.
There's an overreaction to a real problem right now.
Shree, let me get Shree in on this. I mean, you will all interpret the numbers the way you want to, but certainly one could interpret those numbers as well, I don't know, evoking Voltaire's, I disapprove of what you say, but I defend to the death your right to say it. That notion doesn't seem to have a great deal of currency in Canada anymore if those numbers are accurate. Would you agree?
I don't think Voltaire said that. I think his biographer said that about him.
True.
But I'm actually quite heartened by the idea that 91% of is it Canadians, Ontarians, who think that freedom of speech cannot guarantee freedom from social consequences. I think that's fabulous. I too am worried about the idea that radical ideas should be censored, because if a radical idea is I want to kill 6 million people, yes, it should be censored. But if the radical idea is should we defund the police because that is come up as a solution to help an oppressed group stop their killings at the hands of institutions, that shouldn't be censored. So I don't think we can look at any of these issues unless we consider a framework of a power structure. And in the previous conversation, somebody mentioned class privilege. And I don't think you can look at class privilege unless you see how it intersects with other identities as well. Mm-hmm. And so if people who say offensive ideas should not lose their jobs, let's say, it's never been the case. If somebody calls me the C word at work, then there should be some accountability for it. and that's considered pretty normal, right?
Is that a
But
common phenomenon at the Toronto Star? Is that common
it
workplace
is not
dialogue
at
at the
all.
Star?
But
Okay, good. I'm
I'm
glad
not
to hear
sure
that.
why you would think that. I'm not.
Because you used it as an example at work.
I gave it as a purely hypothetical example with the word "if" at the start of my sentence.
But we're using
right?
extreme
So-
examples here. We're
so,
using very
but-
extreme examples.
and all of us are, because you mentioned somebody losing jobs because of a single tweet. And yes, I'm sure it happens, but it's such a small fringe example. We could use excesses and keep arguing endlessly. But if we focus on what Michael called the vast middle, then I think we might get to some reasonable ideas. Now, if people express offensive ideas, and of course they shouldn't be using those offensive or let's say discriminatory ideas to actually discriminate. If we say that they should face no consequences, if somebody says a racial slur, what does that actually mean? It means it shows a certain contempt for a race of people. How do you know whether a person in position of power doesn't give another person a promotion? Let's say they're allowed to say, the person in power, a boss, is allowed to say racial slurs, face no consequences for it, and have they discriminated based on race or not? How do you know? There is no way to prove discrimination. One way to monitor that is how we express our ideas, and not being able to say a racial slur is a pretty basic form of control.
Okay, forgive me. I'm going to jump in here. We're down to our last minute. Irshad, it's for you.
Well, I personally have no problem with the idea that there are social consequences for causing grave offense. Here's the issue. If I, as a brown person, repeatedly offend white people by how I express my ideas to them, and I am in a position of some power. Let's say I'm the diversity director at my company, or the principal of a high school. Does that mean that I should, as a brown person, incur social consequences? I say yes. In order for any kind of diversity, and that includes diversity of viewpoint, to have credibility, we need to acknowledge that when we speak, are individuals. We are not merely mascots of one or another group, oppressed or otherwise. And because we are individuals, we also must take responsibility for how we express ourselves. It's one thing to say, Shree, that white people obviously, should be held to account. It's another to acknowledge that all people should be held to account, regardless of the complexion that they carry. Sure. You may respond, but Irshad, what about power? What about power? Absolutely. I say, this is my view, that power is situational, not static. When you are in a position of power, even if you're not white, you too need to take responsibility for what you say.
And this is where
over whom you have that authority.
This is where, forgive me, this is where the host comes in and says the power of the clock is absolute. And that is our time. Irshad Manji, Jonathan Kay, Michael Coren, Shree Paradkar. That was an extraordinary conversation, and I'm so grateful all four of you spared some time for us on TVO tonight. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.